banging on the door came before sunrise, and Alira Whitmore knew, even half asleep, that it meant something had gone wrong. Her mother's voice was already shaking through the wooden panels. "Get up, get dressed. Cover your face, now." Alira sat up in the narrow bed she had slept in since she was a child, the same bed pushed into the darkest corner of the house, farthest from the window, farthest from anyone who might glance in and see her. She reached for the gray cloth veil hanging on the bedpost, the one she had worn every day of her life since she was 7 years old, and wrapped it around the lower half of her face before her mother even opened the door. Hannah Whitmore stepped inside, her eyes wide with a fear that Alira had seen 100 times before, but never quite this strong. "They are here," her mother said. "The king's men. They are gathering every unmarried woman in the village square within the hour." Alira's stomach dropped. Every unmarried woman, that included her. For 18 years, Alira had been kept from public life as much as her parents could manage. She helped in the garden before dawn and after dusk, when the lanes were empty. She fetched water from the well at the far edge of the village, never the one near the market. She had not stood in the village square in the daylight since she was a small child, and even then, only with her face wrapped tight. It was not always this way. Alira remembered fragments of a time before the veil, of laughing in the grass with other children, of her mother brushing her hair in the sunlight without flinching. But that had ended the day the wolf came out of the tree line and went for her younger brother Colin, who was only 4 at the time, and had wandered too close to the forest's edge while their mother's back was turned. Alira had been 7. She had thrown herself between her brother and the animal's jaws without thinking, the way you do when the person you love most in the world is about to be hurt. She had scars to show for it, one long mark running from her cheekbone down toward her jaw, pale and permanent, a map of the moment she had saved her brother's life. But the village elders did not see courage, they saw a curse. A child marked by a wild beast, they said, in low voices meant to sound wise, must be marked for a reason. Bad luck follows blood like that. Hide her face, they told her parents, or bad fortune will follow this family and this village both. Alira's parents, frightened of being cast out themselves, had listened. And so began a childhood spent behind cloth, a girlhood spent in corners, a life built entirely around not being seen. Now, at 18, she stood in her room while her mother's hands trembled trying to tie the veil straight, and she braced herself for whatever this new trouble would bring. "Why does the king's summons matter to us?" Alira asked quietly. "Surely they will not want someone like me." Her mother's hands stilled for just a moment. "It is not a request," Hannah said. "It is a command from the Alpha King himself. Every eligible woman in every allied village must present herself. There is no exception written for hiding, Alira. Not even for you." Word had reached Ashwood 3 days earlier that Kaelin Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Realms, was traveling through the smaller villages under his protection, searching for a woman to stand beside him as his queen. It was not simply a matter of romance. The northern packs were fractured, weakened by years of mistrust between smaller villages like Ashwood and the larger, wealthier strongholds closer to the capital. Whoever the king chose would help him unite what generations of fear and rivalry had torn apart. Alira had heard the news the way she heard most news, secondhand, through walls, never expecting it to touch her directly. She was, after all, a girl who did not exist in public life, a girl whose own parents had spent 11 years making sure the world forgot she had a face at all. But apparently, kings did not care about village secrets. Kings cared about lists, and Alira's name was on one. Her father, Edward Whitmore, waited outside with his cart, his jaw tight and his eyes refusing to meet hers as she stepped out into the gray morning light. He said nothing the entire walk to the square, and Alira understood without being told that he was ashamed, though whether he was ashamed of her or ashamed of what he and her mother had done to her, she could not say for certain. The square was already filling when they arrived. Alira had never seen so many people gathered in daylight, and every one of them seemed to be staring, not at her specifically, not yet, but at the general commotion of soldiers in deep blue cloaks moving through the crowd with quiet authority, checking names against scrolls, directing young women into rows near the old stone well. A soldier approached the Whitmore family, his eyes scanning the scroll in his hand. "Alira Whitmore," he read aloud, his voice carrying farther than she wanted. "Here," her mother answered quickly, stepping slightly in front of her daughter as if she could still shield her from the world the way she used to. The soldier's eyes flicked toward Alira, then paused on the veil covering most of her face. He did not comment. He only made a small mark beside her name and gestured toward the rows of waiting women. Alira felt her heart pounding as she took her place among strangers, all of them dressed in whatever finery their families could manage, hair styled, faces bare and hopeful. She alone stood wrapped in gray cloth, and she felt every pair of eyes that landed on her linger just a moment too long. A girl beside her, no older than 16, leaned close and whispered, "Why do you wear that over your face?" Alira did not answer. She had learned long ago that silence drew less attention than explanation. The morning stretched on. Women called forward in small groups to be looked over by a pair of stern advisors who seemed to be narrowing the enormous crowd down to something more manageable before the king himself would even appear. Alira watched as women were sent to one side or the other, some smiling with relief, others fighting back tears of disappointment, though she could not yet tell which side meant success and which meant failure. When her name was called, she felt her father's hand grip her shoulder for just a moment, an unfamiliar gesture of comfort that nearly undid the careful composure she had built around herself. "Go on," he murmured. "Whatever happens, go on." Alira stepped forward on unsteady legs, aware of her mother's held breath behind her, aware of the whispers already starting among the other candidates. The veiled girl. What is she hiding? Why would she even come? One of the advisors, an older woman with sharp eyes and a clipped voice, looked Alira over from a short distance away. "Remove the veil," she instructed, the way one might instruct a servant to remove a stain. Alira's hands went cold. "I would rather not," she said, as respectfully as her shaking voice allowed. "This is not optional," the advisor said. "Every candidate must be seen clearly. The king's law applies to all equally, regardless of village or standing." Around her, murmurs rippled through the crowd, sharper now, more curious. Alira felt Hannah step forward as if to intervene, to beg, to explain, the way she always had. But before her mother could speak, a new voice cut through the square, low and even, carrying an authority that made every soldier straighten and every whispering mouth fall silent at once. "Let her keep her composure," the voice said. "I will see her face myself when she is ready, and not a moment before." Alira turned, along with what felt like the entire square, and found herself looking, for the first time, at Cailan Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Realms. He was younger than she expected, though there was nothing soft about him. He moved through the parting crowd the way water moves around stone, unhurried, certain of his place in the world. His eyes, when they finally settled on Alira, held none of the curiosity or judgment she braced herself for. They held something closer to patience. "I did not travel here to frighten anyone into showing me something they are not ready to show," Cailan said, addressing the advisor without raising his voice, though every word landed with weight. "Step back. I will speak with this candidate myself." The advisor hesitated only a moment before obeying, stepping aside with a small, stiff bow. Alira stood frozen, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She had expected many things from this day: ridicule, rejection, perhaps even the quiet cruelty of being sent home in front of everyone. She had not expected to be seen, truly seen, by anyone at all, let alone by the most powerful man in the Northern Realms. Cailan studied her for a long moment, not her veil, but her posture, the way her shoulders had curled inward as if trying to make herself smaller, the way her hands twisted together in front of her. "You may keep the veil for now," he said finally, his voice gentler than she thought a king's voice could be. "But I would like to speak with you, when this gathering is finished. Alone, if you are willing." Alira glanced back at her mother, whose face had gone pale with a mixture of fear and disbelief, and at her father, whose expression she could not read at all. She looked back at the king, at this man who, for reasons she could not begin to understand, had just protected her from something she had spent her entire life dreading. "I am willing," she heard herself say, though she barely recognized her own voice. Cailan nodded once, a small, decisive motion, and then turned back to address the rest of the gathered crowd, his voice rising to carry across the square once more, laying out the process for the days ahead, the villages still to be visited, the timeline for his final decision. But even as he spoke to hundreds of others, Alira could not shake the feeling that something enormous had just shifted beneath her feet, some quiet tremor she did not yet have the words to name. For the first time in 11 years, someone had looked at her, veil and all, and had not looked away in disgust. She did not know yet what it would cost her to be truly seen. She did not know how many more trials waited in the days ahead, how many rivals would work against her, how many old wounds would need to be reopened before they could finally heal. She did not know that the boy she had saved so long ago, her brother Colin, now 15, was watching from the edge of the square with tears in his eyes, finally understanding the full weight of what his sister had sacrificed for him. All Alira knew, standing in that crowded square with her veil still in place and her heart still racing, was that something had changed the moment the Alpha King chose to look past the cloth and wait for the woman beneath it. and whatever came next, she suspected, would change everything she had ever believed about herself. The soldiers began organizing the candidates into smaller groups, explaining that those chosen to continue would be summoned to the Great Hall by evening, while those who would not proceed further were free to return home with their families and their thanks for attending. Illyra's group, she soon learned, would remain. Her mother found her amid the shifting crowd, gripping her arm with a strength Illyra had not felt from her in years. "What did he say to you?" Hannah whispered urgently. "What does he want?" "I do not know," Illyra admitted honestly. "He only asked to speak with me later." Her father said nothing, but for the first time that day, Illyra saw something new in his eyes when he looked at her. Not shame, something closer to fear, though not the same fear as before. This fear seemed to be for himself, for the years of choices he had made, choices that suddenly felt very small beneath the weight of a king's unexpected kindness. The family was directed toward a row of benches set up along the edge of the square, where families of remaining candidates could wait while final arrangements were made for the evening. Illyra sat quietly between her parents, her hands folded in her lap, her mind replaying the moment the king's eyes had met hers again and again, searching for some explanation she could not yet find. Around her, other candidates whispered among themselves, some clearly familiar with one another from wealthier villages, their laughter easy and confident in a way Illyra had never known. She caught pieces of their conversation, comments about her veil, quiet speculation about why the king had shown her such unusual attention. One voice, sharper than the rest, carried further than perhaps its owner intended. "Perhaps he only wants to make an example of her," the girl said to her companion, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "A kindness for the cameras, nothing more. Kings do that sometimes, to seem generous." Illyra felt the words land like small stones against her chest, but she did not turn to see who had spoken. She had grown skilled, over the years, at absorbing cruelty without letting it show on what little of her face remained visible. Still, the words lingered, planting a seed of doubt that grew heavier as the afternoon stretched into evening. Perhaps the girl was right. Perhaps this was nothing more than a performance of mercy, a story the king could tell later about his own generosity, with Illyra serving only as a convenient example rather than someone he had any real interest in. By the time the sun began sinking behind the tree line, casting long orange shadows across the square, Illyra had convinced herself that whatever came next would end in disappointment. It always did. Hope had never once served her well in 18 years of hiding, and she saw no reason tonight would be any different. A soldier approached the family as the light faded, informing them that Illyra alone was requested inside the Great Hall, where temporary quarters had been arranged for the king's business in Ashwood. Her parents would be permitted to wait nearby, but the audience itself would be private. Hannah's grip on her daughter's arm tightened one final time before releasing her. "Be careful," she whispered, though Illyra was not entirely sure what her mother meant by the warning, whether it was fear of the king, or fear of what her daughter might say to him, or fear of everything all at once. Illyra followed the soldier through the gathering dusk, past torches being lit along the stone path leading to the hall, her veil still secure over her face, her heart still uncertain of what waited for her inside. Whatever the king wanted from her, she told herself, she would meet it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through 11 years of hiding. She had survived far worse than a difficult conversation. She could survive this too. But as the great wooden doors of the hall swung open before her, revealing Cailan Ashford standing alone near a tall window, the evening light catching the sharp lines of his face, Illyra felt something she had not expected to feel walking into this meeting. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something dangerously close to hope. The hall was quieter than Illyra expected, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears after the noise of the crowded square. Tall candles lined the stone walls, their light flickering against old tapestries that told stories of battles and treaties long settled. Cailan stood near the window, his back partly turned, watching the last colors of sunset fade behind the hills. He did not turn immediately when she entered, giving her a moment to steady her breathing, though she was certain he had heard the doors open. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, turning to face her. "I know today asked a great deal of you already." Illyra remained near the entrance, unsure how close she was permitted to stand in the presence of a king. "I did not think I had much choice," she admitted honestly, then immediately wondered if such bluntness was unwise. To her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "You did not," he agreed, "though I would still like to think you are here now because you chose to be, not merely because a soldier told you to walk this way." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and he seemed to accept her silence without discomfort, gesturing instead toward a pair of chairs near the window where a small table held 2 cups of warm tea, untouched. "Please, sit," he said. "I promise this will not feel like the square." Elira crossed the room slowly, lowering herself into the offered chair with careful posture, her hands folding in her lap the way they always did when she felt uncertain. Kaelin took the seat across from her, close enough to speak easily, far enough to respect the space she clearly needed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elira could feel his gaze on her, not invasive, not demanding, simply present, the way sunlight rests on skin without asking permission. "May I ask you something?" Kaelin said eventually. "And you may refuse to answer if you wish." Elira nodded slightly, bracing herself. "Why do you wear the veil?" he asked. "Not the story others tell about you. I would like to hear it from you." The question landed differently than she expected, not curious in the way strangers were curious, hungry for gossip or shock. This felt like a question asked because he genuinely wanted to understand, not because he wanted a story to repeat later. Elira considered lying, the way she often did with strangers who asked too many questions. She considered simply saying it was tradition, or a personal choice, anything simpler than the truth. But something about the quiet honesty in his expression made the practiced lies feel suddenly unworthy of the moment. "There was an accident," she said slowly, "when I was very young. My brother was in danger, and I did what I could to protect him. It left a mark on my face. The elders in my village decided the mark meant something it did not mean, and my family believed them." Kaelin's expression did not change into pity, which she had feared, nor into disbelief, which she had also feared. Instead, something sharper crossed his features, something that looked almost like quiet anger, though clearly not directed at her. "What did they decide it meant?" he asked carefully. "They said it was a curse," Elira answered. "That a child marked by danger was marked for a reason, and that hiding me would keep the curse from spreading to others." Kaelin was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly before he spoke again. "And your family believed this enough to hide you for 11 years. It was not phrased as a question, but Elira answered anyway. "They were frightened," she said. "Frightened of the village turning against them if they did not obey the elders. I do not think they ever truly believed the curse, not entirely. But fear does not always require belief. It only requires enough doubt to make hiding feel safer than standing firm." Something in her own words surprised her as she said them aloud, a clarity she had never quite allowed herself before, always too close to the pain to see it so plainly. Kaelin seemed to notice the shift in her too, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "I do not believe your face carries any curse," he said quietly. "I believe it carries proof of something far rarer than most people in this world ever show. Courage large enough to risk everything for someone you loved, at an age when most children barely understand what danger means." Elira felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and she looked down at her folded hands to keep the emotion from showing too clearly, though she suspected the veil hid little from someone paying this much attention. "You do not know that it was courage," she said softly. "You have only heard my version of the story." "Then let me hear the rest of it," Kaelin said. "Tell me what happened, from the beginning, if you are willing." And so, for the first time in her life, Elira told the full story to someone outside her immediate family. The wolf emerging from the tree line, her brother wandering too close to the forest's edge, while their mother's attention was elsewhere for only a moment, the way she had not thought, only moved, placing herself between the danger and the small boy she loved more than anything in the world. She told him about the days afterward, the fear in the village, the elders gathering to decide what her scar meant, the moment her parents agreed to the veil, believing it was the only way to keep their family safe from suspicion. Kaelin listened without interrupting, without offering false comfort or empty reassurance, simply listening the way few people ever had, as if her story mattered enough to be heard completely, before being judged at all. When she finished, the hall had grown fully dark outside the windows, the candles burning lower, casting long shadows across the stone floor. "Thank you," Kaelin said quietly, "for trusting me with that." Elira did not know how to respond to gratitude for something that had cost her so much to say, so she simply nodded, watching him carefully, waiting to see what he would do with the truth she had finally spoken aloud. "May I ask one more thing?" he said. She nodded again. "Would you be willing to remove the veil?" he asked. "Not for the crowd, not for anyone else, only for me, only if you feel ready. I will not think less of you either way." Elira's heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. 11 years of hiding rose up inside her all at once. Every warning her parents had given her, every whispered fear from the village elders, every instinct built over more than a decade of protecting herself from a world that had decided long ago what her face meant. before ever truly seeing it. But there was something in Kalen's expression that made the fear feel smaller than it had in years, something steady and certain, as if he had already decided, long before this moment, that nothing beneath the veil could change what he already believed about her. Slowly, with trembling hands, Elira reached up and untied the cloth from behind her head, letting it fall away from her face for the first time in front of someone who was not family. The scar ran pale and clear along her cheek, a permanent reminder of the moment she had saved her brother's life, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Kalen's eyes moved over her face slowly, not with shock, not with the pity she feared, but with something closer to quiet reverence, as if he were seeing something rare and important for the very first time. "You were right to protect your brother," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "And whoever told you this mark should be hidden was wrong, in every possible way." Elira felt tears finally spill over, not from sadness, but from something she had almost forgotten how to feel, relief, mixed with a fragile, uncertain hope that perhaps, after 11 years, someone finally saw her exactly as she was, and did not look away. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed until a soft knock interrupted the quiet, a soldier informing the king that the evening meal awaited him with the other village leaders, a duty that could not be delayed much longer. Kalen rose slowly, his eyes lingering on Elira's face a moment longer, before he spoke again. "I would like you to remain among the candidates moving forward," he said. "Not as a gesture, not as an example, because I believe there is more to know about you, and I find myself wanting to know all of it." Elira, still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness of her uncovered face, could only nod, unable yet to trust her voice with words worthy of the moment. As she walked back out into the cool night air, the veil now held loosely in her hand rather than tied across her face, she felt the weight of 11 years beginning, however slowly, however uncertainly, to lift. She did not yet know that her rivals among the candidates had already begun whispering about the strange attention she had received, planting seeds of resentment that would soon grow into something far more dangerous than gossip. She did not yet know how fiercely her own parents would need to confront the choices they had made, or how deeply her brother Colin carried guilt for a sacrifice he had never fully understood until today. All she knew, walking back toward the small home she had grown up hiding within, was that for the first time since she was 7 years old, she had let someone see her face, and the sky had not fallen because of it. News traveled faster than any messenger could carry it, and by the time Elira returned home that night, half the village already knew that the Alpha King had asked her to remove her veil in private, and that she had not been sent away in disgrace afterward. Her mother was waiting by the door when she arrived, wringing her hands, her face pale in the candlelight. "Well?" Hannah asked immediately, her voice tight with anxiety. "What happened? What did he say to you?" Elira stepped inside, the veil still loose in her hand rather than tied across her face, and watched her mother's eyes widen at the sight of the exposed scar, an expression Elira had rarely seen aimed at her, something close to surprise mixed with old, familiar fear. "He asked me to tell him the truth," Elira said quietly, setting the veil down on the table, rather than immediately retying it, "and I did, all of it." Her father emerged from the back room, his expression unreadable, though his eyes moved quickly to her uncovered face, and lingered there longer than they had in years. "And," Edward asked carefully, "what does he intend to do?" "He has asked me to remain among the candidates," Elira answered. "He said there was more he wished to understand about me." Silence settled over the small home, thick and uncertain. Elira watched her parents exchange a glance she could not fully interpret, something between relief and dread, as if the possibility of their daughter's continued presence in the selection carried consequences they had not fully considered. "That is good news, is it not?" Colin said from the doorway of the room he shared with no one now that he was older, his voice hesitant. He was 15 now, tall for his age, with the same dark hair as his sister, though his face remained unmarked by the danger that had shaped so much of her life. Elira turned to him, offering a small, tired smile. "It is good news," she agreed, "though I do not yet know what it means for any of us." That night, sleep came slowly, if at all. Elira lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Kalen had spoken, every expression that had crossed his face when he first saw the scar she had hidden for so long. She did not know whether to trust the warmth she had felt in his presence, whether it was genuine interest or simply the practiced kindness of a king accustomed to putting frightened people at ease. The following morning brought new instructions delivered by soldiers moving through the village at dawn. All remaining candidates were to gather at midday near the Great Hall, where they would be transported together to the king's temporary court, established at the crossing point between several allied villages, to continue the selection process over the following weeks. Alira's parents helped her prepare what little she owned to bring with her, the atmosphere in the small home strange and unfamiliar. Equal parts pride and anxiety neither of them quite knew how to voice. "You do not have to wear the veil anymore, if you do not wish to," her mother said quietly, folding a spare dress into a worn traveling bag. "Not if the king himself has already seen your face and found no fault in it." Alira paused, considering the offer that would have seemed impossible only 2 days earlier. 11 years of instinct told her to keep the cloth close, to protect herself from the judgment of strangers who had not yet earned the trust Kaelin had somehow earned in a single evening. But something in her mother's voice, something new and uncertain, made her wonder if her mother was finally, quietly, offering an apology she did not yet know how to speak aloud. "I will decide when I arrive," Alira said gently, folding the veil and placing it in her bag, rather than around her face. "But I thank you for saying so." The journey to the king's temporary court took most of the day, a long procession of carriages and walking candidates moving along dusty roads between villages Alira had never seen beyond the borders of Ashwood. She sat quietly near the back of one carriage, watching unfamiliar countryside pass by, listening to the easy chatter of other candidates, who clearly knew one another from previous gatherings and events she had never been permitted to attend. One voice, sharp and confident, rose above the rest as their carriage slowed to pass through a narrow village gate. Alira recognized it as the same voice from the square the day before. The girl who had suggested Kaelin's kindness was nothing more than performance. "I heard the veiled girl removed her covering for the king himself," the voice said to her companions, just loud enough to ensure the words carried. Perhaps he only wished to see how bad it truly was. Laughter followed, quiet but unmistakable, and Alira felt her face grow warm, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. She did not turn to confront the speaker, recognizing the futility of arguing with cruelty dressed as curiosity. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the passing countryside, reminding herself silently that she had survived far worse than whispered mockery from strangers who knew nothing real about her life. Still, the words lingered uncomfortably, and by the time their carriage finally arrived at the sprawling grounds surrounding the king's temporary court, Alira's earlier hope had dimmed slightly beneath a familiar weight of doubt. The court itself was larger than anything Alira had ever seen, stone buildings surrounded by gardens carefully maintained despite the temporary nature of the gathering, soldiers and servants moving efficiently between tasks, the air thick with the kind of quiet tension that comes before something important. Candidates were shown to shared quarters, simple but comfortable rooms arranged around a central courtyard where meals would be served, and announcements made throughout the coming weeks. Alira found herself assigned to a room with 2 other young women, neither of whom she recognized from the carriage ride, both eyeing her curiously as she entered, her veil once again in place after the long journey through unfamiliar territory. "You must be the one everyone is discussing," one of the young women said, not unkindly, extending a hand in greeting. "My name is Priya, this is Delphine. We heard the king himself requested a private conversation with you yesterday." Alira accepted the offered greeting cautiously. "My name is Alira," she said. "And yes, that is true, though I am not certain what to make of it any more than you are." Delphine, a quiet girl with careful eyes, studied Alira for a long moment before speaking. "It is unusual," she admitted honestly. "Most candidates barely receive a formal introduction before the final selections begin. A private conversation on the very first day suggests something more." Alira did not know how to respond to that observation, uncertain herself what it suggested, and grateful when Priya changed the subject to lighter matters, questions about Ashwood, about the journey, about the small details of daily life that helped ease the strange tension of finding herself suddenly surrounded by dozens of strangers, all competing for the same uncertain future. That evening, all remaining candidates gathered in the central courtyard for a formal address from Kaelin himself, the first time Alira had seen him since their private conversation the night before. He stood at the front of the gathered crowd, dressed simply, despite his position, his expression calm and measured as he addressed the assembled women. "I know this process asks a great deal from each of you," he began, his voice carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. "You have left your homes, your families, your familiar lives, to stand before strangers and be judged by standards none of us fully control. I do not take that sacrifice lightly." Alira watched him carefully, searching for any sign that his words to her the night before had been performance rather than truth, but found nothing in his expression that suggested insincerity. "In the coming weeks," Kaelin continued, "we will spend time together, in groups and individually, so that I might understand not simply who you present yourselves to be, but who you truly are. beneath whatever expectations brought you here. I ask only for honesty in return for the honesty I intend to offer each of you." His eyes moved briefly across the crowd, and for the smallest moment, Illyra felt certain they paused on her, though she could not be entirely sure amid the sea of faces surrounding her. As the gathering dispersed and candidates began making their way back toward their quarters, Illyra felt a hand touch her arm gently. Turning, she found herself facing the sharp-voiced girl from the carriage, her expression now carefully composed into something like polite curiosity, though her eyes held a coldness that betrayed the mask. "Illyra, was it?" the girl said smoothly. "I am Vanessa, from Millbrook. I could not help but notice the king's particular interest in you yesterday. How fortunate, to receive such attention so early in the process." Illyra recognized the false warmth immediately, the same careful cruelty she had encountered countless times before from those who found her existence, veiled or not, somehow threatening to their own sense of place in the world. "It was not fortune," Illyra said simply, keeping her voice even. "It was only a conversation." "Of course," Vanessa said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "though I imagine such conversations mean a great deal to someone accustomed to hiding away entirely. It must feel quite remarkable, being seen at all, regardless of the reason." The words were carefully chosen to wound, and Illyra felt them land precisely as intended, though she refused to let the sting show on her face. Instead, she met Vanessa's gaze steadily, drawing on years of practiced composure built from a lifetime of enduring far crueler words than these. "I imagine it does feel remarkable," Illyra replied evenly, "though I suspect you might understand that feeling yourself, one day, if you are ever brave enough to be truly seen rather than simply admired from a comfortable distance." Something flickered across Vanessa's expression, surprise perhaps, or irritation at being met with composure rather than the flustered response she had clearly expected. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her companions trailing behind her, their whispers resuming the moment they believed themselves out of earshot. Priya, who had witnessed the exchange from a short distance away, approached Illyra with an expression of quiet admiration. "That was well handled," she said. "Vanessa has a talent for finding weakness in others. It is rare to see someone meet her without flinching." Illyra offered a tired smile, the exhaustion of the long day finally catching up with her. "I have had a great deal of practice not flinching," she admitted. As the two young women walked back toward their shared quarters beneath the darkening sky, Illyra found herself wondering how many more encounters like this awaited her in the weeks ahead. How many rivals would see her unexpected attention from the king, not as something to celebrate, but as a threat to be undermined however possible. She did not yet know that Vanessa's resentment would grow into something far more calculated than whispered insults, or that the coming weeks would test not only her composure, but her growing, fragile belief that perhaps, after 11 years of hiding, she finally deserved to be seen. That night, lying in her unfamiliar bed within the king's temporary court, Illyra removed her veil entirely for the first time among strangers, setting it aside on the small table beside her bed, and fell asleep without it for the first time in longer than she could remember. Over the following days, the king's temporary court settled into a careful rhythm, mornings filled with shared meals and quiet observation, afternoons dedicated to smaller gatherings where Kaelin spent time with groups of candidates, learning their histories, their hopes, the reasons each believed she might serve the Northern Realms well as its queen. Illyra found herself watching these gatherings with a mixture of curiosity and unease, uncertain how she fit among women who spoke easily of trade agreements between villages, of diplomatic customs, of family lineages stretching back generations. She had spent her entire life hidden away from exactly this kind of conversation, and she felt the gap in her knowledge keenly whenever the topic shifted beyond simple daily matters. Yet Kaelin seemed to seek her out with a consistency that surprised her, small conversations during shared meals, brief exchanges while walking between gatherings, moments that felt unplanned and genuine rather than performed for an audience. He asked about Ashwood, about her daily routines, about small details of her life that seemed inconsequential to her, but which he received with careful attention, as though every piece of information mattered. During one such conversation, several days into her time at court, Kaelin asked about her brother. "Colin, is it?" he said, as they walked slowly along a garden path bordered by carefully tended flowers, a respectful distance maintained between them for propriety's sake. "What is he like?" Illyra smiled slightly at the question, an easy warmth entering her voice for the first time since arriving at court. "He is kind," she said, "gentle, in a way that surprised everyone given how our childhood unfolded. He carries a great deal of guilt over what happened to me, though he has never said so directly. I see it in the way he watches me sometimes, as if bracing for something he cannot quite name. Do you resent him for it? Kaelin asked gently. The accident, I mean. Do you ever wish you had not intervened? Alira considered the question seriously, aware that her honest answer mattered more to this conversation than any careful diplomacy she might offer instead. Never, she said firmly. Not once, in 11 years, have I regretted protecting him. I only wish the village had seen my choice as clearly as I understood it myself, rather than twisting it into something to fear. Kaelin nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That is precisely what troubles me most about the story you told me, he admitted. Not the accident itself, but the response that followed. A village that punishes courage rather than honoring it teaches its children the wrong lessons entirely. Alira glanced at him, surprised by the depth of frustration evident in his voice. Frustration that seemed to extend beyond simple sympathy into something closer to genuine anger on her behalf. You seem troubled by it more than I expected, she observed carefully. Kaelin paused near a stone bench, gesturing for her to sit before answering. I lost my own mother young, he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. She died protecting our village from a threat most people never fully understood, and for a brief time afterward, certain elders in my father's court suggested her death was a sign of weakness rather than strength, that a true leader would have avoided the danger entirely, rather than confronting it directly. Alira listened, recognizing something familiar in the pain evident beneath his carefully controlled words. My father corrected that thinking swiftly and firmly, Kaelin continued, but I never forgot how quickly fear can distort courage into something shameful, if left unchallenged. When I heard your story, I recognized the same pattern immediately. A village choosing fear over truth, punishing the very courage that protected them. Alira felt something shift within her chest, a recognition of shared understanding she had not expected to find in someone whose life had been so different from her own, in every visible way. I am sorry, for your mother, Alira said quietly. Thank you, Kaelin replied, and I am sorry, for the years you lost hiding from something that should have been celebrated rather than concealed. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the garden quiet around them, and Alira felt, not for the first time since arriving at court, that perhaps this connection growing between them was built on something sturdier than simple curiosity or obligation. As the days continued, Alira noticed Kaelin's attention toward her becoming a subject of increasingly open discussion among the other candidates. Some approached her with genuine warmth, curious about her history, impressed by whatever quiet strength they perceived beneath her careful composure. Others, like Vanessa and her small circle of companions from wealthier villages, grew colder, their whispered comments sharper whenever Alira passed within earshot. During one shared evening meal, Delphine, who had grown into something like genuine friendship with Alira over the preceding days, leaned close to speak quietly. You should be careful, she murmured. Vanessa has been asking questions about you, more than simple curiosity. She spoke with several servants yesterday about your family, your village, details that seem unusual for someone merely curious about a rival. Alira felt a small chill at this information, though she kept her expression neutral. What kind of questions? She asked. Details about your scar, mostly, Delphine admitted. Where it came from, whether the story you have told is entirely accurate, whether your family has any history the king might find concerning if he knew the full truth. Alira's stomach tightened. There is nothing concerning in my family's history, she said, though even as she spoke the words, old fears resurfaced. Memories of village elders whispering about curses and bad fortune. Fears that had shaped her entire childhood, despite having no basis beyond superstition. I believe you, Delphine said gently. But Vanessa does not need truth to cause trouble. She only needs enough uncertainty to plant doubt in others' minds. That night, Alira found sleep elusive once again, her mind circling back repeatedly to Delphine's warning. She had spent 11 years hiding from judgment, and the thought of facing renewed suspicion now, just as she had finally allowed herself to hope for something different, felt like a cruel echo of everything she had already survived. The following morning brought an unexpected development that pushed aside, for the moment, her concerns about Vanessa's quiet scheming. A messenger arrived from Ashwood carrying a letter for Alira, sealed with her family's simple mark rather than any official stamp. She opened it privately in her shared quarters, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting immediately. Alira, the letter began, I hope this finds you well, and that the king's court treats you with more kindness than our own village managed across so many years. Your father and I have spoken a great deal since you left, about the choices we made, about the fear that guided decisions we now recognize as unjust toward you. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I ask for it in this letter. I only wish you to know that we see now, clearly, what we failed to see for far too long. You were never a curse upon this family. You were, from the very beginning, its greatest strength and its greatest sacrifice. Colin sends his love and asks that you remember, whatever happens in the court, that you have already proven your worth far beyond anything a crown or a king could confirm. Elira read the letter twice, tears gathering in her eyes as she processed words she had waited 11 years to hear from her mother. It was not a complete resolution, not yet, not without the direct conversation she suspected still needed to happen between them eventually. But it was, undeniably, a beginning. She folded the letter carefully and placed it alongside her veil, now rarely worn since arriving at court. A growing collection of evidence that perhaps the life she had known before was finally beginning to shift into something new. Later that same day, during a larger gathering of candidates in the main courtyard, Kaelin announced the results of the initial evaluation period, narrowing the large group of candidates down to a smaller number, who would continue through more focused stages of consideration in the weeks ahead. Elira listened as names were called, her heart pounding with an anxiety she had not expected to feel this strongly, uncertain until the very last moment whether her name would be included among those continuing forward. Elira, from Ashwood, Kaelin announced, his eyes finding hers across the crowded courtyard as he spoke her name aloud. Relief flooded through her, mixed with something else entirely, a fragile pride she had rarely allowed herself to feel, the sense that perhaps she truly did belong among these women, veil or no veil, scar or no scar. As the gathering dispersed, Vanessa's name notably absent from those continuing forward, Elira caught sight of the other woman's expression from across the courtyard, cold and calculating, fixed directly upon her with an intensity that sent an unmistakable warning through her chest. Whatever quiet scheming Delphine had warned her about, Elira suspected, was far from finished. If anything, Vanessa's exclusion from the continuing candidates seemed only to sharpen her resolve, and Elira found herself wondering, with growing unease, what form that resolve might take in the days ahead. With the group of remaining candidates now smaller, the atmosphere at court shifted into something more intimate and more intense. Elira found herself spending increasing amounts of time in Kaelin's company, sometimes alongside other candidates during formal gatherings, but increasingly during quieter moments as well. Walks through the gardens, shared meals taken away from the larger crowd, conversations that stretched long into the evening beneath the stars. During one such evening, seated together near a small fire in a quiet courtyard reserved for private conversation, Kaelin asked her something that caught her entirely off guard. "Do you believe you could be happy here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the grounds surrounding them, at the life such a question implied. Not simply accepted or tolerated, but genuinely happy, living a life so different from the one you knew in Ashwood. Elira considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not yet know what happiness looks like outside of hiding," she admitted honestly. "For 11 years, my greatest hope each day was simply to avoid notice, to avoid causing trouble for my family. I am still learning what it means to want something more than that." Kaelin nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That seems like an honest answer," he said. "More honest than most I have received from candidates eager to please me with reassurances they believe I want to hear." "Would you prefer reassurance?" Elira asked, a hint of gentle teasing entering her voice for the first time since arriving at court. Kaelin laughed softly, a warm sound that eased some of the tension between them. "No," he admitted. "I find myself far more interested in truth, however uncertain it may be, than in comfortable performances designed to flatter me." Their conversation continued easily from there, touching on lighter topics, favorite foods, childhood memories, the small details that build genuine connection between two people, rather than simple diplomatic courtesy. Elira found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, the careful guardedness she had maintained for so long, slowly, cautiously, beginning to soften in his presence. As the days passed, this growing closeness between them did not go unnoticed by the other remaining candidates, and while some responded with genuine warmth, congratulating Elira on the king's evident regard, others grew increasingly resentful, their whispered comments sharper, their glances colder whenever she passed. Delphine, who remained a steady friend throughout this period, grew increasingly concerned about the undercurrents she observed among the remaining candidates. "You should know," she told Elira quietly one evening, "that Vanessa has not left court, despite being excluded from the continuing candidates. She has remained as a guest of one of the visiting village leaders, and she has been spending a great deal of time with several servants who work closely with the king's household." Elira frowned, uneasy at this news. "What do you think she intends?" she asked. "I do not know for certain," Delphine admitted, "but I do not believe her intentions are kind. She has spoken to several people about your family's history in Ashwood, pressing for details beyond what seems reasonable for simple curiosity. Illyra felt the familiar chill of old fears resurfacing, memories of village elders whispering about curses, about danger, about the supposed shame carried within her very existence. She had believed, perhaps naively, that leaving Ashwood might leave those old fears behind as well. Delphine's warning suggested otherwise. That same week, Kaelin requested a more extended private conversation with Illyra, inviting her to join him for a walk beyond the immediate grounds of the court, along a quiet path bordering a small river that wound through the surrounding countryside. "I want to understand something more fully," he said, as they walked slowly along the water's edge, the afternoon sun casting gentle light across the rippling surface. "The elders in your village, the ones who insisted upon the veil, what became of them, after you left for court?" Illyra considered the question carefully. "I do not know precisely," she admitted. "They remain in Ashwood, presumably continuing much as they always have. I do not believe my absence has changed their thinking, if that is what you are asking." "Do you believe they were wrong? Entirely?" Kaelin pressed gently. "Or do you believe some part of their fear held genuine reason, even if their conclusion was mistaken?" Illyra paused, considering the question more seriously than she had allowed herself to in years. "I believe fear often masquerades as wisdom," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. "The elders were frightened, genuinely frightened, of forces they did not understand, the wolf attack, the danger that came from the forest, the uncertainty of protecting a small village against threats larger than themselves. That fear was not unreasonable. But rather than confronting the actual danger, they chose instead to blame the person who had shown courage in the face of it, because blaming me was simpler than confronting their own helplessness." Kaelin listened intently, his expression growing more thoughtful with each word she spoke. "That is remarkably clear thinking," he said finally, "for someone who has spent so many years being told the opposite." Illyra allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I have had a great deal of time to think, during 11 years of hiding," she admitted. "There is little else to do behind a veil except think." They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while longer, the sound of the river gentle beside them, before Kaelin spoke again, his voice more serious now. "I want you to know something, Illyra," he said, using her name directly for the first time in their conversation, a small shift that felt significant despite its simplicity. "Whatever happens in the weeks ahead, whatever pressures or doubts arise from others around us, I do not intend to let old fears dictate decisions that matter this much. You have shown me more genuine courage in these past days than most people demonstrate across entire lifetimes. I will not allow anyone to convince me otherwise, regardless of what stories they might attempt to spread." Illyra felt the weight of his words settle over her, both reassuring and unsettling in equal measure, aware that his statement implied he already anticipated some challenge to their growing connection, some threat waiting on the horizon that she had not yet fully understood. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "Has something happened that I am unaware of?" Kaelin hesitated slightly before answering. "There have been whispers," he admitted. "Suggestions that your scar carries meaning beyond what you have shared with me, dark implications I do not believe for a moment, but which certain individuals seem determined to spread regardless of truth." Illyra's stomach dropped, old fears rushing back with sudden overwhelming force. "Vanessa," she said quietly, more statement than question. "I do not know the source with certainty," Kaelin said carefully, "though I have my suspicions. What matters more to me is ensuring you understand that I do not believe these whispers, regardless of who spreads them or why." Illyra appreciated his reassurance, but felt the old, familiar fear tightening in her chest nonetheless. The sense that no matter how far she traveled from Ashwood, no matter how much progress she made toward finally being seen and accepted, the shadow of superstition and fear seemed determined to follow her, seeking new ground to take root in whenever old ground proved insufficient. As they made their way back toward the main grounds of the court, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, Illyra found herself bracing for whatever challenge waited ahead, drawing on the same quiet strength that had carried her through 11 years of hiding, preparing herself once again to stand firm against fear disguised as certainty. She did not yet know how quickly that challenge would arrive, or how severely it would test not only her own resolve, but the fragile trust growing between herself and the king who had promised, however sincerely, that he would not let old fears dictate what mattered most. The whispers Kaelin had warned her about arrived in full force only 2 days later, spreading through the court with a speed that reminded Illyra uncomfortably of how quickly gossip had once traveled through the narrow lanes of Ashwood. It began quietly, servants exchanging glances when Illyra passed, candidates who had previously greeted her warmly now offering only stiff, uncertain nods. By midday, Delphine arrived at their shared quarters with an expression of barely controlled anger. Vanessa has been telling anyone who will listen that your scar is not simply the result of an accident, Delphine said without preamble, closing the door firmly behind her. She claims it carries a mark of dark forces, something that could bring misfortune upon the king's bloodline should he choose you. She has convinced several of the more superstitious village leaders visiting court to take the claim seriously. Elira felt her chest tighten with familiar dread, the exact fear she had carried for 11 years now resurfacing in this new, unfamiliar setting, proving that distance from Ashwood had not been enough to escape it entirely. That is not true, Elira said, her voice steadier than she felt. She knows it is not true. Truth rarely matters to someone determined to protect her own position, Delphine replied grimly. Vanessa lost her place among the candidates, and I believe she has decided that if she cannot succeed, she will ensure others question whether you deserve to either. Word of the growing rumor reached the formal council of village leaders advising the king by that same evening, and Elira found herself summoned, along with Kaelin, to address the concerns directly before a gathered assembly of leaders from several allied villages, all clearly anxious about the implications, should the rumors prove true. The gathering hall felt far colder than it had during her private conversation with Kaelin weeks earlier, filled now with skeptical faces, murmured conversations that quieted only slightly as she entered alongside the king. An older man, introduced to her only briefly as Elder Garrick from one of the larger allied villages, rose to address the assembly as Elira and Kaelin took their places at the front of the hall. We do not make these inquiries lightly, Garrick began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But when concerns arise regarding forces beyond ordinary understanding, forces that might affect not simply one candidate, but the future stability of the king's own bloodline, we owe it to all our villages to examine the matter fully before proceeding further. Elira felt Kaelin tense slightly beside her, though his expression remained carefully composed as he responded. I have already examined the matter fully, Kaelin said, his voice calm but firm. I have heard the full account of how this mark came to be, directly from Elira herself, and I find nothing in that account suggesting anything beyond what it plainly is, a scar, earned through an act of remarkable courage. Garrick did not appear entirely satisfied. With respect, my lord, he said carefully. Courage and curse are not always so easily separated in matters involving forces from the wild places. Our own traditions teach caution regarding marks earned through encounters with such dangers. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the assembled crowd, and Elira felt the weight of dozens of uncertain, skeptical eyes settling upon her once again, the same suffocating scrutiny she had spent 11 years hiding from finally catching up with her in this unfamiliar hall, far from the small village where it had first begun. May I speak? Elira asked quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice despite the fear tightening in her chest. Kaelin glanced at her, something like quiet approval crossing his expression before he nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Elira rose slowly, facing the assembled leaders directly, rather than shrinking from their scrutiny, as instinct urged her to do. I understand your caution, she began. I was taught the same caution myself, for 11 years, by elders in my own village, who believed exactly what some of you now suggest, that this mark upon my face carried some dark meaning beyond a simple accident. I believed it too, for a time, because I was a child, and children believe what the adults around them insist is true. The hall grew quieter as she continued, every eye now fixed upon her. But I have had 11 years to consider this mark, she said. 11 years to understand precisely where it came from, and precisely what it means. It came from throwing myself between a dangerous animal and my 4-year-old brother, without hesitation, without thought for my own safety. It means that when someone I love faced danger, I acted, rather than freezing, rather than fleeing. If that is a curse, then I do not understand what virtue could possibly look like instead. Silence followed her words, heavy and uncertain, until Elder Garrick spoke again, his voice slightly less certain than before. That is a compelling account, he admitted, but accounts alone cannot always dispel deeper concerns rooted in generations of tradition. Then perhaps, Kaelin said, rising to stand beside Elira, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, it is time those traditions were examined more carefully, rather than accepted simply because they are old. I have traveled across every village in these northern realms, and I have seen, again and again, how quickly fear disguises itself as wisdom, how easily communities punish the very courage that protects them, simply because that courage leaves visible marks that make people uncomfortable. He turned to address the assembly more directly, his voice growing firmer with each word. I will not build my reign upon fear disguised as tradition, he continued. I will not allow superstition to punish a woman for an act of bravery that most in this hall would struggle to match, regardless of the mark it left upon her. If this council requires further proof of my conviction on this matter, I am prepared to offer it, directly and without hesitation. The hall remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over the assembled leaders. Illyra felt something shift within the room, uncertainty giving way, slowly, to something else entirely, though whether it was genuine reconsideration or simply reluctant deference to the king's clear authority, she could not yet be certain. Elder Garrick, after a long pause, finally spoke again, his voice measured. Your conviction is noted, my lord, he said carefully. Perhaps further discussion on this matter would benefit from additional time for reflection, rather than resolution forced in this single gathering. It was not a full resolution, Illyra understood, but it was, at least, a delay, time enough perhaps to address the root of the rumor before it could cause further damage. As the gathering began to disperse, murmured conversations resuming throughout the hall, Illyra felt Kaelin's hand brush gently against hers, a small, private gesture of reassurance amid the lingering tension. Thank you, she said quietly, once they had stepped away from the immediate crowd. You needed no defending, Kaelin replied. You defended yourself more effectively than any words I might have offered. I am simply grateful you were willing to speak. Later that evening, alone in her shared quarters, Illyra reflected on the day's events with a complicated mixture of exhaustion and cautious pride. She had faced, directly and without hiding, the exact fear that had shaped her entire life, and she had not crumbled beneath it. Whether that courage would prove sufficient to fully dispel the rumors Vanessa had spread remained uncertain, but for the first time, Illyra felt genuinely capable of facing whatever came next, veil or no veil, whispers or no whispers. She did not yet know that Vanessa, having failed to sway the council directly, had already begun planning a more direct and dangerous scheme, one that would force the truth of the matter into the open in a way none of them yet anticipated. 3 days after the council gathering, Illyra woke to find the entire court unusually tense, servants moving quickly between quarters, low voices carrying urgent messages she could not fully hear from where she stood. Delphine arrived at their shared room with an expression Illyra had never seen on her friend's face before, something close to alarm. You need to come with me, Delphine said quickly, gathering Illyra's veil from the small table where it had rested, unused, for several days now. Something has happened, and you need to hear it directly rather than through rumor. Illyra followed her friend quickly through the corridors of the court, her mind racing through possibilities, each darker than the last. They arrived at a smaller meeting chamber where several council members, along with Kaelin himself, stood gathered around a nervous-looking servant girl who appeared to have been crying. What has happened? Illyra asked, stepping into the room despite the tension radiating from everyone present. Kaelin turned to her immediately, his expression grim. Vanessa has made a formal accusation, he said. She claims to have obtained proof, through this servant, that your family in Ashwood has a history connected to dark practices, beyond the simple accident you described. She has presented documents she claims support this account, along with testimony from this servant, who she says witnessed suspicious behavior from your family directly. Illyra felt the ground seem to shift beneath her, old panic rising swiftly despite her best efforts to remain composed. That is not true, she said immediately. There is nothing in my family's history that could support such a claim. The servant girl, trembling visibly, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not want to say these things, she admitted. Vanessa offered me payment, more money than I have ever held at once, if I would confirm details she provided to me. Details about strange behavior from your family that I never actually witnessed myself. I am sorry, I should not have agreed, but my family needed the money desperately, and she made it sound harmless at the time. Relief flooded through Illyra alongside continued anger, understanding now the full scope of Vanessa's scheme. False testimony purchased and prepared in advance, designed to appear credible enough to sway the council's judgment decisively against her. Kaelin's expression had grown darker with every word the servant girl spoke, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Where is Vanessa now? He asked, his voice carrying an edge Illyra had not heard from him before. She remains in the main hall, awaiting the council's decision, one of the advisors answered. She does not yet know this servant has recanted her testimony. Then let us ensure she learns the full truth, in front of everyone she attempted to deceive, Kaelin said, his voice firm with quiet, controlled fury. Within the hour, the full council reassembled in the main hall, along with a curious crowd of candidates, servants, and visiting village leaders drawn by the tension evident throughout the court. Vanessa stood near the front of the gathering, her expression confident, clearly unaware that her scheme had already begun unraveling. Kalen addressed the assembly directly, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall. Several days ago, serious accusations were raised against Alira, of Ashwood, he began. Accusations suggesting dark practices within her family, supported by testimony provided through Vanessa, of Millbrook. I have since learned that this testimony was purchased, deliberately fabricated to deceive this council and damage an innocent woman's reputation. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Alira watched Vanessa's confident expression falter for the first time, her eyes darting nervously toward the servant girl now standing quietly beside Alira. The servant girl, prompted gently by Kalen, repeated her confession before the full assembly, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, describing exactly how Vanessa had approached her privately, offering payment in exchange for false testimony designed to appear credible before the council. Vanessa's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence collapsing entirely under the weight of public exposure. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly, though her voice lacked the smooth certainty she had displayed before the council previously. "I only meant to ensure the council had full information to consider." "Full information does not require payment for fabricated testimony," Kalen replied evenly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "It requires only truth, which you clearly had no intention of providing." The assembled crowd murmured with growing disapproval, and Alira watched as several of the village leaders who had previously seemed swayed by Vanessa's accusations now regarded her with open suspicion instead. Kalen continued, addressing the full assembly directly. "I have said before that I will not build my reign upon fear disguised as tradition," he said. "Nor will I tolerate deliberate deception designed to manipulate this council's judgment for personal advantage. Alira has shown nothing but honesty and courage throughout this process, while Vanessa has shown herself willing to fabricate false accusations against an innocent woman, simply to protect her own damaged pride." Vanessa, recognizing the full collapse of her scheme, attempted one final defense. "She has bewitched you," she said desperately, her composure entirely gone now. "Surely you can see that a common girl from a hidden village could not otherwise capture such attention from the king himself, without some unnatural influence at play." The accusation, rather than damaging Alira further, seemed instead to fully expose the bitter jealousy underlying Vanessa's entire scheme, and several members of the crowd shook their heads with obvious disapproval at such a transparent, desperate claim. Kalen's expression remained calm despite the accusation, though something firm and unwavering entered his voice as he responded. "I have not been bewitched," he said clearly. "I have simply recognized genuine courage and honesty when I have encountered it, qualities that seem, unfortunately, quite rare among those more concerned with status and appearance than truth. Alira has earned my regard through her own character, not through any unnatural influence, and I find it telling that you would rather believe in imaginary magic than accept that she has simply proven herself more worthy than you anticipated." The hall fell silent following this pronouncement, and Alira watched as the council members exchanged glances, clearly reaching a collective, unspoken judgment regarding Vanessa's scheme and its complete failure. Elder Garrick rose slowly from among the council, addressing Vanessa directly. "Given the fabricated nature of your testimony, and the clear intent to deceive this council for personal gain," he said, "you are no longer welcome to remain among the candidates considered for the King's Court, nor within these grounds. You will be escorted back to Millbrook immediately, and this council will inform your village leaders of the full nature of your conduct here." Vanessa's face crumpled briefly before hardening into cold resentment, and without another word, she turned and allowed herself to be led from the hall by waiting guards, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by the bitter awareness of complete, public defeat. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of the day's dramatic events already spreading throughout the court, Alira felt Kalen's hand find hers once again, this time without hesitation, without the careful propriety that had marked their previous interactions. "I am sorry you had to endure this," he said quietly, once they had stepped away from the immediate attention of the crowd. "You have nothing to apologize for," Alira replied. "You defended me before an entire assembly, without hesitation, when it would have been far simpler to remain quiet and let the council decide on its own." "I could not remain quiet," Kalen said, his voice softening, "not when it concerned you." Alira felt her heart racing at the simple honesty of his words, aware that something significant had shifted between them during this trial, a trust forged not simply through pleasant conversation, but through genuine crisis faced and overcome together. That evening, as the court settled back into its familiar rhythm, Alira found herself walking alone through the same garden path where she and Kalen had shared so many earlier conversations, reflecting on the day's dramatic events with a growing sense of quiet, unfamiliar confidence. For 11 years she had believed herself powerless against the fear and judgment of others, resigned to hiding rather than confronting the cruelty directed toward her. Today she had watched that same fear and judgment collapse entirely beneath the weight of simple truth, defended not only by her own steady composure, but by someone willing to stand firmly beside her against an entire assembly of doubters. She did not yet know how deeply this experience would shape the conversations still waiting ahead, particularly the long-overdue reckoning she still needed to have with her own parents, nor how close Kalen's growing feelings for her had moved toward something he intended to make permanent before the selection process reached its natural end. News of Vanessa's public disgrace spread quickly beyond the immediate grounds of the court, carried by returning candidates and visiting village leaders back toward their own homes over the following days. By the time a full week had passed, word had even reached Ashwood, carried through the same network of traveling merchants and messengers that had first brought news of the king's selection process months earlier. Elira learned of this when a second letter arrived from her mother, considerably longer than the first, filled with details about how the village had received the news of Vanessa's failed scheme, and of Kalen's public defense of her daughter before the full council. "The village speaks of little else," Hannah had written. "Some among the elders who once insisted upon your veil now speak carefully, almost apologetically about the situation, though none have yet found the courage to admit their error to me directly. Your father has grown quieter since the news arrived, spending long hours alone in the evenings. I believe he carries a heavier weight of guilt than he has yet found words to express." Elira read the letter several times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she had not expected, some satisfaction at the vindication finally reaching her home village, but also a persistent ache regarding the conversation she knew still needed to happen directly with her parents, rather than through carefully worded letters exchanged across the distance between them. That same week, Kalen announced that he intended to make a brief visit to several of the remaining candidates' home villages, partly as a diplomatic gesture to communities who had sent daughters to the selection, and partly, Elira suspected, because he recognized her own need to return to Ashwood and finally confront the unresolved history waiting there. "Would you accompany me back to your own village?" he asked her privately, the evening before the planned journey. "I believe there are conversations you still need to have, and I would like to be present, if you are willing, though I understand if you would prefer to face this alone." Elira considered the offer carefully. "I think I would like you there," she admitted finally. "Not because I need protection from my own parents, but because I think they deserve to see clearly who has recognized my worth, when they themselves failed to for so long." The journey back to Ashwood felt entirely different from the anxious carriage ride that had first carried Elira away from her childhood home weeks earlier. She rode now alongside Kalen himself, the veil left behind entirely in her quarters at court, her face bare beneath the open sky for the first time during any journey she could remember. Word of their approach reached Ashwood before they arrived, and Elira found the village square filled with curious onlookers, as their small procession finally entered the familiar streets she had spent so many years navigating carefully, hidden behind cloth and careful avoidance. Her parents waited near their small home, Hannah's hands twisting nervously in her apron, Edward standing slightly behind her, his expression carrying the same heavy guilt Elira's mother had described in her letter. Elira dismounted first, approaching her parents slowly, while Kalen remained a respectful distance behind, allowing the family the space needed for this difficult reunion. "Mother," Elira said quietly. "Father." Hannah's eyes filled with tears immediately, her hands reaching toward her daughter's face, hesitating just before touching the visible scar, as if suddenly uncertain whether such contact remained welcome after everything unspoken between them. "You look well," Hannah said softly. "Truly well, Elira. I have thought of little else since you left, wondering whether we did irreparable harm through all those years of hiding you away." Elira felt the old wound in her chest, still tender despite the weeks of healing that had begun at court, but she also felt something new alongside it, a readiness to finally address directly what had remained unspoken for far too long. "I need to say something to both of you," Elira said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "I have carried this pain for 11 years, largely in silence, because I understood, even as a child, that you were frightened, and that fear made you believe hiding me was somehow protecting our family. But I need you to understand fully what that choice cost me." Edward stepped forward slightly, his voice rough with emotion he had clearly been suppressing for some time. "We know," he said. "We have known for years, if we are honest with ourselves, though we lack the courage to admit it, even to each other. We told ourselves we were protecting you, but truthfully, we were protecting ourselves, From judgment, from exile, from the discomfort of standing against the elders who demanded your silence. Alira felt tears gathering in her own eyes now, the weight of finally hearing this direct acknowledgement settling over her with unexpected force. "I forgave you a long time ago, in my heart," Alira said, "because I understood, even then, that fear can make people choose poorly, even people who love each other deeply. But forgiveness does not erase what happened. I lived 11 years believing my own face was something shameful, something to be hidden from a world that would reject me on sight. That belief shaped everything about how I understood myself, and it took a stranger, a king from beyond our own village, to finally show me the truth you both should have shown me from the very beginning." Hannah broke down fully now, her tears flowing freely as she finally closed the remaining distance between herself and her daughter, wrapping her arms around Alira in an embrace that carried 11 years of unspoken apology within it. "I am so sorry," Hannah whispered against her daughter's shoulder. "We failed you, in the way that mattered most, protecting our own comfort rather than standing for what was right, for who you truly were." Edward joined the embrace moments later, his own composure finally breaking as he added his voice to his wife's apology. Years of guilt and unspoken regret finally finding their way into words both of them had needed to speak for far too long. Alira allowed herself to fully receive this long overdue reckoning, feeling something significant shift within her chest as the embrace continued. Not complete healing, perhaps, not an instant erasure of 11 years of pain, but a genuine, necessary beginning toward something better between them. When the embrace finally ended, Alira turned to see Colin approaching hesitantly from the edge of the gathered crowd, his expression uncertain, clearly unsure of his own place within this emotional reunion. Alira extended her hand toward her brother immediately, drawing him into the embrace as well. "This was never your fault," she said firmly, addressing the guilt she had long suspected he carried silently. "I would make the same choice again, without hesitation, 1,000 times over, because protecting you mattered more to me than any scar ever could." Colin's own tears finally fell freely as he embraced his sister fully for what felt like the first time in years, without the careful distance guilt had maintained between them. Watching this family reunion from a respectful distance, Kaelin finally stepped forward once the most intense emotions had settled, addressing Alira's parents directly with the same calm authority he had shown before the full council weeks earlier. "I wanted you both to know directly," Kaelin said, "that your daughter has shown me more genuine courage and honesty during these past weeks than I have witnessed from almost anyone else in my life. Whatever fear guided your choices in the past, I hope you will find, moving forward, the courage to fully embrace the remarkable woman she has always been, veil or no veil." Edward extended his hand toward Kaelin, a gesture of respect and gratitude that required no additional words to convey its full meaning. "Thank you," Edward said simply, "for seeing what we failed to see, for far too long." As the visit to Ashwood continued into the following day, word spread quickly among the village elders who had once insisted upon Alira's veil, several approaching her directly with awkward, hesitant apologies of their own, though Alira accepted these with far less emotional investment than she had reserved for her own family, recognizing the difference between genuine remorse and simple discomfort at having been proven wrong. Before their departure back toward the King's Court, Kaelin made one final, significant announcement to the gathered village, one that Alira herself had not fully anticipated despite the growing closeness between them over recent weeks. "I intend to formally choose my future queen upon returning to court," Kaelin announced to the assembled crowd, "and I wanted the village of Ashwood to be among the first to know that Alira remains my primary consideration for that honor, not despite the courage she has shown throughout her life, but entirely because of it." Alira felt her heart race at this public declaration, aware that whatever remained uncertain about the final selection process, Kaelin's intentions toward her had never been clearer, nor more genuinely felt. As they prepared to depart Ashwood the following morning, Alira glanced back one final time at the small home where she had spent so many years hidden away, feeling, for the first time, that she was not leaving behind shame or rejection, but rather a place of healing, however imperfect, that she could now return to freely, without fear, whenever she wished. Returning to the King's Court felt entirely different from the anxious first arrival Alira remembered from weeks earlier. Word of Kaelin's public declaration in Ashwood had traveled ahead of them, and Alira noticed a distinct shift in how other candidates and court staff regarded her upon her return. Warmer now, more openly respectful, though a few lingering doubts still occasionally surfaced among those who had aligned themselves with Vanessa's earlier scheme. Priya greeted her warmly upon her return to their shared quarters, embracing her immediately. We heard about Ashwood, Priya said, excitement evident in her voice. The whole court is speaking of little else. Are the rumors true, that the king has all but announced his choice? Illyra felt herself blushing slightly, still adjusting to the reality of a declaration made so publicly and so directly. He has expressed his intentions clearly, Illyra admitted, though I understand the formal selection process must still be completed, out of respect for the other candidates and the villages they represent. Delphine, who had remained a steady friend and ally throughout the recent turmoil, joined them with a knowing smile. I do not believe anyone genuinely doubts the outcome any longer, she said, though I imagine the formal ceremony will still carry significant weight, both for the king's authority and for uniting the villages behind his final choice. In the days that followed, Illyra found herself increasingly involved in preparations for what court officials now openly referred to as the upcoming joining ceremony, a formal event that would not only announce Kaelin's chosen queen, but would serve as a broader symbol of unity across the northern realms, bringing together villages that had remained fractured and distrustful of one another for generations. During this period, Illyra spent considerable time with Kaelin discussing the responsibilities that would accompany her new position, conversations that revealed increasingly the depth of thought and care he brought to his role as leader of the Northern Realms. I do not simply want a queen who stands beside me for ceremony, Kaelin explained during one such conversation, walking together through the same garden path that had become a familiar setting for their most meaningful discussions. I want someone who understands, from genuine experience, what it means to be overlooked, misunderstood, judged unfairly by fear and superstition rather than truth. I believe you understand this more deeply than anyone else I have encountered throughout this entire process. Illyra considered his words carefully. What would you want me to do? With that understanding, she asked. I want you to help me change how the smaller villages are treated within our broader system, Kaelin said seriously. Villages like Ashwood, often overlooked by the larger, wealthier strongholds, left to develop their own superstitions and fears without the guidance or support that might otherwise correct such thinking before it causes real harm. I believe, with you beside me, we might begin building something better, more just, for communities that have long been forgotten by those in power. Illyra felt a swell of purpose she had never expected to feel, the possibility that her own painful history might ultimately serve something larger than her personal healing, that her experience of hiding and exclusion might help prevent similar suffering for others in villages much like her own. I would like that very much, Illyra said sincerely. To ensure no other child grows up believing their scars, whatever form they take, must be hidden away in shame. As preparations for the joining ceremony continued, Illyra received word that her family, along with her brother Colin, would be traveling to the king's court to attend the formal event, an honor typically reserved for families of significant standing, though Kaelin had insisted upon their inclusion regardless of Ashwood's humble status among the allied villages. The reunion with her family upon their arrival at court carried a warmth entirely different from the emotional reckoning that had marked their reunion in Ashwood weeks earlier. Hannah embraced her daughter with open joy rather than lingering guilt, and Edward's posture carried a newfound confidence, clearly proud to stand beside a daughter who had proven herself so remarkably capable despite years of unjust hiding. Colin, now noticeably more at ease than during their earlier reunion, pulled Illyra aside during a quiet moment before the ceremony's final preparations began. I want you to know something, he said, his voice carrying a seriousness beyond his 15 years. I have thought a great deal these past weeks about what you did for me when we were children. I do not think I ever properly understood, until recently, just how much you sacrificed, not simply in that single moment of danger, but in all the years that followed, hiding yourself away so completely because of a choice you made to protect me. Illyra placed a gentle hand on her brother's shoulder. You do not need to carry guilt for that choice any longer, she said firmly. I have told you before, and I will tell you again as many times as necessary until you fully believe it. I would make that same choice 1,000 times over, without hesitation. I know, Colin said, his eyes glistening slightly. And I think, finally, I am beginning to understand what that kind of love truly means. I only hope, someday, I might show even a fraction of the same courage you showed me that day. You already have, Illyra said gently, in the way you have grown, in the compassion you show others, in the quiet strength I see in you even now. Courage does not always announce itself through dramatic moments. Sometimes it simply grows quietly, through years of choosing kindness and honesty, even when it would be easier not to. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a court official, informing them that final preparations for the joining ceremony were now underway, and that Alira would need to begin the formal process of preparation alongside the other attendants assigned to assist her. As Alira was led toward the chambers where she would prepare for the ceremony ahead, she caught sight of Kalen across the busy courtyard, engaged in conversation with several visiting village leaders, his posture carrying the calm, steady authority she had come to recognize and admire deeply over these past weeks. He glanced up, as if sensing her attention, and offered her a small, private smile that carried more meaning than any formal declaration could convey, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured together to reach this moment, and everything still waiting ahead for both of them. As evening approached and the final preparations for the joining ceremony neared completion, Alira found herself alone briefly in the quiet chamber prepared for her, staring at her own reflection in a simple mirror provided for this purpose. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she studied her own face directly, the scar running clearly along her cheek, no longer hidden beneath cloth, no longer a source of shame or fear, but simply a part of her story, evidence of a moment when courage had mattered more than safety, when love had outweighed every instinct toward self-preservation. She did not yet know precisely what tomorrow's ceremony would reveal to the assembled crowds of villages, still uncertain about accepting a queen marked so visibly by what many had once considered misfortune. But for the first time in 11 years, Alira felt no fear at the prospect of being fully seen, only a quiet, steady readiness to finally step forward exactly as she was, without apology, without concealment, into whatever future awaited her. The morning of the joining ceremony arrived with clear skies stretching over the king's court, sunlight spilling across the gathered crowds who had traveled from villages throughout the northern realms to witness the formal announcement everyone now anticipated with certainty rather than doubt. Alira stood in the preparation chamber as attendants completed the final touches to her simple, elegant gown, its design honoring both the traditions of the larger court and the humble origins of her own village, a deliberate choice she had requested herself, wanting to honor where she came from rather than erase it entirely in favor of unfamiliar grandeur. Hannah entered the chamber quietly as the final preparations concluded, her eyes glistening with tears of pride rather than the fear and guilt that had once dominated so much of their relationship. "You look magnificent," her mother said softly, reaching to gently adjust a single strand of hair before pausing, her hand hovering near her daughter's visible scar with a question in her eyes. "May I?" Hannah asked quietly. Alira nodded, and her mother gently traced the familiar mark along her daughter's cheek, an act she had avoided for years, always careful to look away from what she had once believed needed hiding. "This has always been beautiful," Hannah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I simply lacked the courage to see it clearly, until someone braver than myself showed me how." Alira embraced her mother warmly, grateful for how far they had traveled together since that anxious morning weeks earlier when soldiers had first pounded on their door demanding her presence at the selection. As the appointed hour approached, Alira made her way toward the grand courtyard where the ceremony would take place, walking alongside her family through corridors lined with curious onlookers, all eager for a glimpse of the woman who had captured the Alpha King's genuine regard through courage rather than mere appearance. The courtyard itself had been transformed for the occasion, banners representing every allied village hanging alongside the king's own colors, a visual representation of the unity Kalen hoped this ceremony might help solidify across the fractured northern realms. Kalen stood waiting at the front of the gathered crowd, dressed formally for the occasion, his expression carrying a mixture of solemn dignity and barely contained joy as Alira approached, her family remaining respectfully behind as she continued forward alone toward the ceremonial platform where Kalen waited. The crowd fell silent as she walked, hundreds of eyes from dozens of villages watching intently, and Alira felt, for just a moment, the old familiar instinct to lower her gaze, to shrink from such overwhelming attention. But she resisted that instinct entirely, walking forward with her chin lifted, her scar fully visible beneath the bright morning sun, refusing any longer to treat her own face as something requiring apology or concealment. As she reached the platform, Kalen extended his hand to help her the final steps upward, his eyes meeting hers with unmistakable warmth and pride. "People of the Northern Realms," Kalen began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard, addressing the assembled crowd directly. "Weeks ago, I began this selection process seeking not simply a wife, but a partner capable of helping unite our fractured villages, someone whose character and courage might inspire the same qualities across our entire realm." He paused, turning to look directly at Alira before continuing. "I found that partner in a woman many of you first knew only through fear and superstition, hidden away for 11 years behind a veil. judged for a mark earned through an act of remarkable bravery rather than any curse. I found in Alira not simply beauty, though her beauty is undeniable, but genuine strength, honesty, and compassion that I believe will serve our people far better than any qualification typically sought in a queen. Murmurs of approval rippled through significant portions of the crowd, though Alira noticed a few faces still holding on to old doubts, remnants of superstition not entirely dispelled despite everything that had transpired over recent weeks. Kalen turned fully to face Alira now, taking both her hands in his own before continuing, his voice softening slightly though still carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Alira," he said, "I do not ask you to stand beside me despite the mark you carry. I ask you to stand beside me because of everything that mark represents: courage that protected someone you loved without hesitation, resilience that endured 11 years of unjust hiding without losing your fundamental goodness, and honesty that never wavered, even when speaking that truth carried genuine risk. I can imagine no partner more suited to help me lead these northern realms towards something better than the fear and division that has too long defined us." Alira felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened, aware of her family watching from the crowd, of Colin's face bright with pride, of her parents finally witnessing fully the value they had once failed to recognize in their own daughter. "I accept," Alira said, her voice carrying clearly despite the emotion evident beneath it, "not because a crown or title changes who I am, but because I finally understand that who I have always been was worthy of being seen, exactly as I am, long before any king ever looked upon my face." The crowd erupted into applause, the formal ceremony continuing with traditional blessings offered by village elders, though Alira noticed with quiet satisfaction that even Elder Garrick, who had once questioned her worthiness so directly before the full council, now offered his blessing with genuine warmth rather than lingering suspicion. As the formal ceremony concluded, and celebrations began throughout the court, extending well into the evening with music and feasting drawing together representatives from villages that had rarely interacted so warmly before, Alira found herself standing quietly with Kalen near the edge of the festivities, watching the joyful chaos with a sense of peace she had never expected to feel so fully. "Do you have any regrets?" Kalen asked quietly, his hand finding hers as they watched the celebration together. "About any part of this journey?" Alira considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the 11 years I spent believing myself unworthy of being seen," she admitted, "but I do not regret the courage that earned this mark, nor the path that led me here, to you, to this moment. Every difficult step brought me exactly where I needed to be." Kalen smiled warmly, drawing her closer as the celebration continued around them. "Then let us ensure," he said, "that no other child in these northern realms ever again believes their own courage should be hidden away in shame, regardless of what mark it might leave behind." Alira nodded, watching her family celebrating nearby, her brother Colin laughing freely alongside new friends he had made throughout the court, her parents standing proudly rather than fearfully among the gathered crowd, finally free from the guilt and fear that had shaped so many difficult years. As the stars emerged fully overhead and the celebration continued late into the night, Alira reflected on the remarkable distance she had traveled, not simply from Ashwood to the king's court, but from a girl taught to hide her own face in shame, to a woman standing confidently as queen, her scar visible beneath the starlight, no longer a source of fear or superstition, but a permanent, powerful reminder of the courage and love that had shaped her entire life. The world that had once hidden her face in shame now saw, clearly and completely, exactly what Kalen had recognized from that very first moment in the crowded village square, a beauty far deeper than any veil could ever conceal, forged not despite hardship, but through it, courage etched permanently into her very skin, finally, fully, seen.